talking about the Spanish transition to democracy, or how we call it here, la transición.
Is there a good idea of why he chose Juan Carlos?
Like Spain was living under the Franco dictatorship from 1939, following the Civil War, to 1975. And it's true that following his death, which was a natural death, the transition into democracy which was sort of managed under King Juan Carlos, because the Spanish government right now is rotten, it's full of corruption, and the country is clearly not doing well. The polls are horrible to them. So what do? They pull out the Franco card. I've seen the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, condemn Franco one day and celebrate an agreement with Xi Jinping the following day. So the idea that you're like these democratic freedom fighters, it's always so like whatever suits the agenda of the day.
Franco actually consolidated power.
Created quite an imperfect democracy in the sense that as long as power was in the hands of the socialist parties, the regime seemed to work just fine. As soon as they lost power in the second election heard, and as atrocious as a dictatorship seems to be by today's logics, if Spain was a country where everything was working fine, you wouldn't see such unrest that eventually leads to a civil war. The political map has been marred with corruption scandals. So there's a lot of reasons to be sad about the state of Spanish democracy these days. And I guess that leads people to ask questions. Is there an original sin to the system?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Capitalismo Podcast. I'm Rasheed, and I'm here with my co-host, Diego.
Great to be here.
And I think the fun part of this podcast is that we're going to be discussing core Spanish and Hispanic world economics and politics, but in English, as you can see, because we don't see that many good content about these really deep issues. And the first episode, this one, we're going to discuss one of the key moments in Spanish history that to this day still impacts how everyone here talks about economics and politics and even corruption, law. It's such a deep topic that I think it's a very good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about the Spanish transition to democracy, or how we call it here, la transición. And it's been traditionally studied abroad in courses about political science or history as a successful case study of how a country moved from a dictatorial regime and into a democracy, and rather peacefully. And to a certain degree, the broader points are correct. That's true. Like Spain was living under the Franco dictatorship from 1939, following the Civil War, to 1975. And it's true that following his death, which was a natural death, the transition into democracy which was sort of managed under King Juan Carlos I, was managed rather swiftly. And in 4 or 5 years' time, Spain was essentially joining all the European institutions, a full-fledged democracy, and so on. So that's being the official take. And to be fair, I think it's broadly on point, but there's so many nuances and so many things that come up. And then there's a lot of stuff that back from the mid-70s that is still haunting Spain today. So obviously, while still keeping a positive eye, in my view, of the transition, there's so many aspects of it that should and can be questioned. And it will be interesting to share this with our audience, because anyone with a little curiosity about not just Spain, but also the Hispanic world has probably heard about the Spain's transition, Chile's transition. They're often compared because they were, in principle, there was no revolution, there was no violence, and there was no rupture of the political system, but rather an evolution of it into a democracy. But boy, there's so much to go into that. We can go down a lot of rabbit holes.
Quite a lot. It's funny because Spain is now. So I'm from Barbados initially, but I've lived now in 3 countries for full time, Spain now being the current place I live. And each country I lived in had this shadow of a transition on it. It was Philippines, the Marcos dictatorship. It was Panama with Torrijos. And now I'm living here in Spain. We have the Marcos transition. So the Franco transition. So it's very interesting to me to see it constantly being a feature of society, because again, where I grew up, this was not a concept. There's no dictatorship. There's no transition. So every time this comes out to animate politics, I'm like, oh, this is different.
Yes, and it's not movie friendly if you think about it, right? There was no uprising, there was no revolution. Franco died in his bed, right? He died of natural causes. This is not to say that there was an opposition to Franco, but this society at that time was kind of passive because at the end of the day, Franco had been in power for a very long time. The Civil War ended in 1939. It had pitted different influences of European powers like fascist and the Nazi regimes from Italy and Germany had sided with Franco. The Soviet Union had been on the side of the Republican side as well. And there was obviously a civil war that has been brought up in movies and cinema, and half the times you watch a Spanish movie, there's some reference to it, right? And still today, there's a very recurrent way to look at Spain and always bring everything back to the Civil War from a foreigner's perspective, right? Sometimes it feels too forced, like a correspondent from the Financial Times or they'll always circle back to Franco. And that's kind of stereotypical, to be frank. But at the same time, the fact is that our current democracy, it's quite young. It's from 1975, or at least the founding blocks were set in 1975, and the process was completed in the following 5-7 years, 3 years later. It really depends. Like people, when do you say that the transition was completed? When the first election was held to elect a democratic constitution, when the constitution was drafted, when the constitution was voted, which was 1978, well, that would be 3 years. But in any case, like the thing here is there was no rupture. Franco died in his bed, and suddenly the king was given all of these absolutist powers, and sensing the momentum for change was appropriate, a process was put in place to bring Spain into a democracy. Today, Spain is kind of considered to be a full-fledged democracy, but there's concerns about the rule of law and the quality of democracy under the current government of Socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez. But in any case, the Magna Carta that he's working with and the pillars of the democracy that he's working with, they all come back from the 1970s. So that's why you need to learn about the transition.
But then it also comes with this other aspect where there is a very broad element of politics, depending on your ideology. I would say, let's not be so quick to conclude that Spain is a democracy. It's not. I was thinking this actually be a much more fringe topic, but over the years, at least from what I can see in Spain, it's not that fringe anymore to say that, maybe it isn't that democratic as we claim it or we like it to be. But we will get there. We'll get there. We need to now actually launch into some details on how we are going to discuss the transition in the first place. And of course, as we mentioned, the correct starting point will be the Civil War. At least the antecedents to Civil War. And so how did Franco actually consolidate power? This is where we're going to start to get to a point where we discuss the transition.
Well, Franco was one of the three generals that staged the coup against the republic that had been in power since 1931. He was one of the many that few felt aggravated by the way in which the Republican regime had essentially taken a lot of liberties against political opponents and created quite an imperfect democracy in the sense that as long as power was in the hands of the socialist parties, the regime seemed to work just fine. As soon as they lost power in the second election held under the Republic, which was in 1933, as soon as that happened, a lot of revolutionary violence began. And at some point in 1934, Franco was one of the military leaders that actually stood up for the rule of law at the time and stopped a socialist revolution.
That was in Asturias.
Yes, and which with ramifications in Catalonia and so on. But at the end of the day, you could sense that there was still a lot of monarchical people that did not feel like the system incorporated them. And once the revolutionary climate began unbearable, an election had been called for 1936. There's a lot of doubts about the results of that election. There's a lot of research casting a shadow over what the official and the real outcomes were. At the end of the day, the truth is that the country was absolutely fractured at that point. And when the coup happens, Franco leads a campaign. The other two military leaders that started this coup passed away during the Civil War. They died. One of them due to a helicopter accident, and the other one, or a plane accident, and the other one in combat. So Franco was left there and just was able to bring a victory for his troops and for the so-called national side. And the Republican side, which had also had, like I said, a foreign influence on their end, was ultimately unsuccessful. The horrors of the Civil War, like one can only imagine, right? Brothers fighting each other, neighboring territories pitted against each other, and still scars Spanish society in a way today. And that's how Franco came to power. And he's often dismissed as not very charismatic, quite undecisive at times. But the man was in power from 1939 to 1975. So he obviously had some I would say, leadership traits that are probably not studied with a proper perspective, because the man was able to keep his regime in power for a long time. And as atrocious as a dictatorship seems to be by today's logics, he did have quite a lot of support back in the day. So there's a lot of questions that can be asked about the Franco regime, and that'll sure give us another topic for another episode.
One of the things that I was surprised by learning about the Franco ascension, in my mind, I initially thought Spain was settled, it was, more stable, and then Franco kind of, pushed the system to a convulsion.
Yes.
But that's not the case. It was a very fragmented system. It was coming off of another dictatorship into the Second Republic. The king at the time, Alfonso XIII, he resigned.
He just left the country. The king just left the country. That's how much of a mess it was.
And then you had these Republican uprisings. So it wasn't like a stable system. Everything was pretty much in chaos all the time.
There had never been an official de facto transition to a republic. In fact, the monarchy had given power to a dictator, a military dictator called Miguel Primo de Rivera, and he held power for most of the 1920s under a corporativist approach to the management of the country and the economy. And then following that, in the 1930s, when the result in the local election seemed to be very good for the Republican parties, that's when, and not so good for the monarchic forces, that's when the king just fled Spain in 1930. And essentially the Republic was put in place in 1931. From the get-go, it wasn't a smooth transition into that. It was quite chaotic, if you think about it. And the fact that power was first mostly in the hands of the left, but then people just swung completely to the right on the second election. There was these uprisings in 1934, and just come 1936, the election had the country so split, and then the coup happened. So that's the context. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Because if everyone was... if Spain was a country where everything was working fine, you wouldn't see such unrest that eventually leads to a civil war. Unfortunately, there was so much political violence going on, a lot of wrongdoing on the hands of the different Republican governments. And if that regime had been successful, there wouldn't have been a civil war probably, but it was never able to bring the population together into the basic elements of what the system wanted to be. That's why it collapsed.
Yeah. So now we have Franco ascended to power, head of state, full caudillo de España, full power, full control, and he's there until 1975. In 1968 or 67, he did the succession law to name Juan Carlos I as his successor when he eventually dies, which happened in 1975.
Yeah.
Is there a good idea of why he chose Juan Carlos?
Well, he despised his father. The Bourbon monarchy of French origin had been essentially running the monarchy in Spain for most of history, following the 18th century switch. Prior to that, Spain had been mostly in the hands of the Austro-Hungarian monarchs of the Habsburg house, or the House of Habsburg, right? Los Austrias, we call them here, the Austrian kings, right? And then we had the French kings, the Bourbons, right? And when Juan Carlos comes to power in 1975, essentially 10 years after he had been proclaimed to be Franco's successor by the dictator, you have to keep in mind that in principle, the one that should have assumed power if you wanted to bring back the monarchic system would have been Juan Carlos's father, which was referred to as Don Juan. And but he had been on exile. He's obviously the son of the king who fled in the 1930s, Alfonso XIII. But he had been living on exile in Portugal. And the fact that Franco was a dictator sort of obviously posed the question that, okay, if I'm outside of the country at this point, because my family had to leave because of the Republic, that means that I'm obliged to operate under the fact that most people are not seeing the political system of Spain very favorably, so probably my best chance of making it back is to be critical of Franco, right? And probably the men had good reasons to be critical of Franco as well, like many people did. After all, we're talking about a very traumatic period and a dictator who was in power from 1939 to 1975. But obviously, because he had distanced himself so much from Franco, he wasn't going to be an option. But Franco, I guess, saw the opportunity to just bring back the monarchy through his son. The elderly son actually died. It was shot by Juan Carlos in an accident, in a hunting accident, which there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that. But I don't know how to, like, that's another rabbit hole.
Right.
Okay. But so when Juan Carlos was essentially groomed to be the successor, and then he was presented to Spanish society in a very clean way. He will always, do like the humanitarian mission, or just because he was well trained as a military man, he would just be shown like Navy ships or like presented like that to Spanish society as a capable young man that knew how to speak different foreign languages, including English, of course, and French. And now we've found out that, for instance, Franco sent him as his envoy to the Saudi countries when the 1973 oil crisis hit. And Juan Carlos apparently is the one that secretly brokered the deal to get Saudi and Middle Eastern oil at a bargain price for Spain. And then it's also become apparent that he was doing it also in exchange of a little kickback.
Right.
That explains why he has still to this day a large fortune to his name. Today, King Juan Carlos is kind of an exile, de facto exile. In Saudi Arabia, in Abu Dhabi. So in Abu Dhabi. So that connection exists, but it shows that Franco trusted him because he sent him as an envoy. He positioned him in the in the official TV reports about how the country was going and so on. So I guess he was the natural leader, but he grew into the role. He was universally accepted as someone who wanted to bring the country together.
So, okay, now in 1975, Franco died, and now Juan Carlos, following the law, now becomes head of state. In the same period, there is this more, a rising sentiment that Spanish society should be transitioning to a more democratic landscape. And Juan Carlos we'll come to this point in a bit more detail soon, but he was, he at that time, and obviously still to this day in some factions, he's seen as like the person that guided Spain into democracy. And one aspect I find very curious is that he was able to do that very largely in part because of Francoist dictatorship level laws that he inherited. And he was able to essentially, so when Franco died, the prime minister that took over, the prime minister that lasted after Franco was Carlos Arias Navarra. And essentially Juan Carlos dismissed him, or maneuvered to have him dismissed, and also at the same time maneuvered in conjunction with Torquato Fernandez Miranda to get Adolfo Suarez to become the prime minister because he had a much more liberalizing tendency. So this was not some, it was a lot of let me control the system going forward to move it one way.
Yes, he steered the ship He was in command. Look, Spanish society, following the very strong economic development in the 1960s, was ready for democracy. It was passive in its opposition to Franco because he had clearly consolidated power and there wasn't much room for opposition. Of course, there would be like unrest here and there, and by all means, it was an authoritarian regime. But it was it lasted so long. So it lasted so long for a reason. It was able to kind of bring civil society into being passive, which still is an issue for Spaniards today. Maybe too paternalistic at times. Not to engage in really changing the political process. That's stuck with Spanish society probably. And then at the same time, the fact that he inherited that society that had gotten wealthier, but at the same time, thanks by the way to a radical liberalization of the economy, but that's a topic for another day that took place in 1959. But thanks to that, Spanish society was richer, and Spanish society was ready, but it had to be commanded. It had been commanded by Franco for so long. So I don't think the leadership really existed to do it somehow else. If Franco had been toppled, if Franco had been removed, then you could argue, okay, there was an opposing power that was able to just set up a completely counter example of how the country should be run or how the regime should be built. But it wasn't like that. Franco, at the end of the day, he died in his bed. So that's something, murió en la cama. So that's something a lot of historians come to when you try to explain to younger generations like us, is that, okay, when you look at it through the lens of 2025, there's a lot of things from 1975 that may catch your attention. But if you look at it from the lens of the 1975 Spain, it isn't that hard to understand. So you brought up the basic pillar of the process, which was de la ley a la ley, a través de la ley, which means from law to law through law. So essentially they took the Franco laws and the system of governance and they reformed all these laws in a process that lasted 3 years until Spaniards voted for a constitutional assembly. In the meantime, but the final moment it's 1978 when the constitution is voted and the new state, which is a constitutional monarchy, is claimed. So today, although Franco dies in 1975, most people would trace back 1978 to be the beginning of the new regime, which means that the transition in principle lasted 3 years, 1975 to 1978. But there's a lot of nuances there. You could argue that it was only complete once a coup d'etat was stopped in 1981, which put an end to any idea that the Franco military elite could come back. Or you could say, no, it only stopped in 1982 when the socialists came to power, which means there was actually a transition from right to left, and that proved that the system was inclusive, or whatever you want to put it. But I would say, like, for simplicity purposes, 1975, 1978, that's the period we're talking about. So
a very core tension point with the 1978 marker of transition is this. So, for example, we have intellectuals like Antonio Garcia Trevijano, and he's a good representation of this kind of school of thought, where, yes, you had the elections in 1977 when people voted for a new Cortes, but the people, general population, had no input on the structure of the new constitution. And then you would say, okay, well, but the Cortes designed the Constitution and then they sent it to referendum in 78, and that had a 67% turnout, and then 87% of that population voted in favor of the referendum, therefore, but that's sufficient. He would say, but it was either vote for the Constitution or nothing. So it wasn't really a practical discussion about how to design the system. His view is that if you had a real democratic version of the transition, then, I guess in his view, you wouldn't probably come up with a monarchy at the other side, where the way how, for example, party systems are managed now in Spain to this day is from that same period also. So there is this tension point that, well, is it really that much democratic given you use the laws of Franco? The people who were installed by Franco essentially ran transition. the king, non-democratic, it also ran transition. And at the same time, after the new constitution came to be enacted, many of the people, again, from Franco period, continued to run the new democratic institutions of Spain. So what do you think of that critique?
That critique, I think, has resonated a lot with some people in recent years. These writings are not recent, but they have come back to life with growing disaffection towards just the overall political and economic system of Spain. So when you fast forward to 2025, you actually realize that Spain hasn't really grown that much in the last 10, 15 years, that it was the worst performing of the large countries in Europe and during the Great Recession. It was the worst performing country during the COVID crisis. The political map has been mirrored with corruption scandals. So there's a lot of reasons to be sad about the state of Spanish democracy these days. And I guess that leads people to ask questions. Is there an original sin to the system? Well, there could be if you are looking at it from the perspective that the king has been named by Franco. But and you could say that voting on how the system was transformed wasn't completely a la carte, so that you could just choose and pick and choose everything you wanted about the democracy. But let me tell you, I don't think it works like that. We just saw the process in Chile, where a lot of people were very excited about the drafting of a new constitution. But when you draft a new constitution, you need to elect an assembly, so you get more infighting between politicians. We know all about the U.S. Constitution and how that went very well. And many of our democratic nations these days, their constitutions are quite old. We're not used to a constitutional assembly. For instance, a Spaniard that is like me, I'm 36. I haven't seen a constitutional assembly in my life. But then I was following the process in Chile, and at the end of the day, it's just like it's another parliament full of politicians that don't agree, don't like each other, don't get together on anything, and don't compromise on anything. And it was so unsuccessful in Chile that the process collapsed. And they drafted one constitution that everyone rejected. And then they drafted another constitution that everyone rejected. So democratically speaking, twice now, a referendum has led to the same Chilean society that wanted to distance itself from the Pinochet inherited constitution, which has been reformed in any case. But actually, twice half Chileans sided with the Pinochet constitution, right? So it just begs the question, like, would politicians today, if you position this as a completely open process in which you could, the referendum wouldn't be about just the whole constitution in itself, but rather every single article in it. Do you think that's practical? Do you think that would lead to a higher understanding? I don't think it would. In 1977, the all political parties were democratically elected to this constitutional assembly. They drafted a compromise-based document, which I think it's obviously an issue when you have an idea of what the state should look like, and you want it to look the way you think, right? But compromise was important at that point in time, because Spain had come from a dictatorship and a civil war and a traumatic republic as well. So if you did not want blood being shed, if you wanted a successful re-understanding, I guess that compromise that was seen at that time today feels like, why did we compromise on that? We should have not gone for this. Fair point, but the Constitution can be amended and reformed, every single bit of it. And the Spanish Constitution is quite flexible. I think you can at the end of the day apply really right-wing and really left-wing policies with the Spanish Constitution. It kind of leans more into the social democratic side of things. The way it reflects private property, for instance, it's not fully it's not U.S. type of protection. But at the end of the day, it's quite a flexible document. So I think a lot of thought is paid to that, but not enough thought is paid to the complication of bringing everyone together. You had people that had fought each other in a civil war, standing together, embracing after this constitution was passed. And I wouldn't lose the symbolic elements on that. And let me tell you one thing. Our grandparents and parents were a lot more proud of that constitution than we are as their grandson. And, maybe that's okay. Maybe we're overthinking stuff too much.
Okay. But another layer then of the same angle of critique is that from the transition or that negotiation aspect, this whole famous consenso de pasillos, this whole, informal conversation that really birthed the power of the current political structure. You have, for example, you have the party in Spain that's generally considered to be the center-right PP party, came from Alianza Popular,
yeah.
which was from Manuel Fraga, who was a Francoist minister. So that even all the institutions, the core kind of centrist institutions, still kind of come from that lineage. And because of how Spain structures their closed party list elections, it's a strange decision, I feel, that even if you're going to be this kind of more democratic transition and held up as such, there is a lot of things to say that maybe it is democratic in comparison, but is it complete? Is there a point where you can say, transition is still need to be more transitioning happening?
I think that point could be argued, but at the same time, right now, you would never agree at an understanding point, like on the same polarization that you see in the US and in other countries. Well, one would argue that polarization in the US was kind of overblown by the media. Looking at the recent results, there was a far more cohesion under the Trump platform than most people would admit. But in any case, in the case of Spain, the problem is that when you go into that line of thinking, which is it's reasonable to say that yes, some people some of the founding fathers of the Constitution had been involved with the Franco regime. But there's two ways to look at this. None of those that were involved had been on the hardline, repressive, authoritarian side of things, as much as they had been more on the more constructive, reformist, opening up side of things, like Suarez or Fraga. And second of all, what about the other side? Because a lot of the leftist leaders of the time had been involved in quite radical movements and processes during the Civil War and the Republic. The leader of the Communist Party, Santiago Carrillo, he was one of the founding fathers of the Constitution. He has also been thought to play a key role in a genocide that happened on the outskirts of Madrid in Paracuellos. So I don't think that whenever people weigh these comments, they're not considering the other side. It's a right-winger throwing this at the communist. It's a communist throwing this at the right-winger. But what about the more complex scenario of the overall goal that was bring everyone together, the separatists together, the left-wingers, the right-wingers, the ones that were communists, the one that had been working under Franco, bring them all together under the same umbrella. I think that cannot be lost. And at the same time, the finger pointing, it goes both ways because that's a very easy narrative to use. To say, like, yes, but the leader of Alianza Popular, which is today's Popular Party, was a Franco minister. Yeah, but to me, look, he was the governor of Galicia, which is my home region, for a long time. And I think he was a full-fledged democratic leader at that time. So I think he moved with the times like a lot of Spaniards did. So I think this is a problem with history, judging stuff from 1975 with the eyes of 2025 is complicated. And one thing, though, about Spanish electoral votes being closed, you do get a list. You cannot choose your candidates for Congress. You vote for the full party, but not for the Senate. For the Senate, you can choose, and no one chooses.
But the Senate has less power, though.
It does,
but it's not as important.
But if it was, something that people demand, you would see, like, how people would actually do, like select this leader from this party and then cross that leader from that other party, and they don't.
I think if the Senate actually had a much more powerful aspect to play in politics,
which I wish it did, by the way, yeah, but
maybe people actually put more effort into it.
Yeah, it's a weak chamber. It's not like the U.S. Senate for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's always thing that I've always thought that yes, I agree. It would be better to have these lists open. But how many people in the street know more than the number one and the number two and the number three of each party? And how many of them would opt for I will choose this guy from this party and then I will check the box for this guy. I don't think many of them would, quite frankly. Like, people aren't that deep into for people who care and who love, we call them cafeteros, right? For the coffee drinkers that love to be on top of everything. I think it is. So it's a typical proposition that will come up every now and then, right? How to improve Spanish democracy? One of the keys is to open up the lists whenever you vote. Yeah, but I mean, fine with me. I wouldn't complain, but I don't think it would really change anything.
So one of the things I find interesting is how this is not at all while in some aspects it sounds like a historical conversation, it's history, but for example, you mentioned Manuel Fraga, who we mentioned something. He was the Presidente de Junta de Galicia, and for a little point in time, Feijóo was also his vice president. I know Feijóo is the president of PP. It's not that long in history. These are currently active conversations. Everything's still pretty much connected.
Yeah, I've seen the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, condemn Franco one day and celebrate an agreement with Xi Jinping the following day. So the idea that you're like this democratic freedom fighters, it's always so like whatever suits the agenda of the day. Whenever there's something that is very useful here in political terms for the Spanish left these days, which is what we call the Franco card. Whenever because the Spanish government right now is rotten, it's full of corruption, and the country is clearly not doing well, and the polls are horrible to them. So what do? They pull out the Franco card, and they just decide to speak about Franco, and they're financing with the taxpayers' money. They're doing even escape rooms to simulate what it was like living in the times of Franco in a prison or something like this. So at the end of the day, yes, it still resonates in Spanish politics. And as you say, we're talking about 1975, but this is 2025, and people discuss these things. And it's interesting because the transition was studied outside of Spain as a success.
Right.
But these days, it's a more contested issue locally.
So just to go back a bit to some of the critique about transition again. One of the other main critiques I find, perhaps even persuasive, it depends on how you frame it, is the Pacto de Olivo, which is, the amnesty law where the persons that committed law crimes during the Franco period, they were given amnesty by the new transition government to say, let's just kind of leave that behind. Let's not actually try to go back and solve these crimes, these tortures, these extortions, all those kind of things like that. And to a point where I believe there was actually even courts in Argentina that was trying to try some of the Franco crimes, kind of extraterritoriality and so on, because in Spain, it was let's call it a day, we're going to move on. A lot of people, even at that time, it's not a new critique, at that time was like, this was not the best approach. This seems a very kind of, giving too much, essentially placating too much the Franco period just in the name of transition, but we're not actually getting justice. We're not actually trying to figure out all these problems that other countries in their transition tried to do. Obviously, most notoriously Argentina after the dictatorship of the 80s. How do you think that critique works out when it comes to thinking about how democratic and the transition was?
Well, that's certainly a very complicated element of the process. And there's another one that is the fact that King Juan Carlos couldn't be judged based on his actions as a head of state. Couldn't be brought to court. So he was essentially given a pass in terms of the equal treatment of all citizens in front of the court. So a lot of that, it came with the pack, I guess. And because the transition was a top-down transition, it wasn't a bottom-up transition, I guess it makes sense, right? There's not a lot of criticism I can make specifically to that, or a lot of nuances I can bring to the table. It is what it is. It is an elite that is on the same hand. On the one hand, it's doing the harakiri, right? Mm-hmm. It's killing its ability to run the country autocratically, and it's allowing the democratic system to flourish. But at the same time, it's obviously looking for it. In public choice terms, it's very obvious, right? You're okay with the transition as long as it doesn't hurt your specific position. Through the years, roughly 20 billion euros have been spent on, recovering the bodies of people that were victims of the regime at some point due to mass murder or to the horrors of the civil war. And a lot of effort has been put into the so-called revision of history, which I think has been very often kind of partisan on the left wing side, but still, I guess that kind of makes up for some of the original sin that you could argue is that element of the amnesty that was de facto given, right? The olvido, the ley del olvido, which you bring up, it means the law of forgetfulness, right? I think that in a way, the spirit of the era was to look forward. Mm-hmm. Take this off for what it is. That it doesn't mean we always have to look backwards. It doesn't mean we always have to look forward. At the same time, today it does seem like we look a lot backwards. Mm-hmm. So I think that needs to be factored into the conversation somehow. But if we're talking a bit about this on very specific terms, what can you say? It is what it is.
Mm. So another element that has now become a bit soured when you think about transition was essentially the pride people had in King Juan Carlos, mm-hmm. in his ability to guide transition effectively, smoothly, because it worked out in its principles. But years later, Juan Carlos is now literally in exile from Spain. And people it almost essentially brought down his scandals that we can discuss, essentially almost brought down the entire image of the monarchy in Spain after he had such decades and decades and decades of very strong public approval. I'm curious if the image of, there is the fall of the image of Juan Carlos also kind of made people review some of their assumptions about how the transition worked out properly, or if not properly, for Spain.
It's a very complicated moment for his son, because so far people still support the monarchy to a much greater percentage than they do a republic. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it's a 2/3, 1/3 split in Spanish society. Okay, and you don't see any institution in Spain gets so much consensus, except for maybe Real Madrid. Okay, and not even. Rafael Nadal probably is the most, the only one that could actually bring the country together. But all joking aside, still today, monarchy gets 2/3 of approval. If it's a good year, they'll get up to 75. If some scandals or some criticism is coming around, it'll go down to around 60%. But the party with the highest popularity these days polls at 33. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's quite more of an inclusive institution than anything else. But of course, King Felipe VI, he's been watched very closely by everyone in Spanish society, because the veil of ignorance over his father's wrongdoings has fallen. And up until 2010, more or less, Juan Carlos had probably the best image of any head of state across the world. Mm-hmm. He was such a diplomatic powerhouse. You could compare him, probably only Queen Elizabeth II from the UK probably had more soft power in her hands. He was a deal maker. He was a fantastic diplomatic envoy, and he was just seen as this man that had just done so good for the country. And then he had a private hunting trip with his mistress, and everything just fell apart. He himself fell apart because he suffered a huge injury in his hip, had to be flown back to Spain. Pictures emerged of him hunting elephants in Africa, which was legal, where he was doing it, but of course it just doesn't look well in front of the Spanish people. And the whole mistress thing, as you can imagine, became kind of scandalous. And then more mistresses started popping up. And then it became apparent that we had actually paid like a pin-up girl from the 1980s to stay quiet. And that had been placed on the taxpayer. Then it also became apparent that he had been getting kickbacks of the oil sent from the Saudis. And none of this has gone to trial. So these are all informations that are publicly available out there. But we always should take it, with the fact that because of his, the Constitution granted him, the ability to be exempt from investigation. So he's being brought to trial by the mistress, by this particular mistress, the first one that I mentioned, Corina, in the UK, and she failed. So, but this was about the money he had supposedly given to her, a donation, which he later wanted retracted. So today, people think that Juan Carlos probably took advantage of his position. And although he did steer the ship towards democracy successfully, a lot of the things he was doing behind closed doors do not resonate so much with Spaniards. And I know we're going to talk about some of the political stuff that he was involved, so maybe we'll just jump into that, because there was an attempted coup d'etat in 1982, and there's always been some shadow or conspiracy theory about the king's role there. But at the end of the day, I don't think Spaniards today really question him that much in terms of the life in public service. But rather more about his private conduct and the just overall disappointment that brought together.
Right. So you kind of mentioned just now, so the coup in 1981 was the 81, right? In 81. Yeah. Kind of.
I was going to correct you and tell you 1982. You know more about it. You're right. It's 1981, of course.
So that has, I think, kind of framed as like the final element of transition.
Mm-hmm. Or the test, the big test.
Right.
Yeah.
And essentially what happened, some of the military hardliners from Franco period saw the things of liberalization happening, and they were not having it. And they stormed the Cortes Generales, the Diputados chambers, and she fired some guns in the air. I think the bullets are still kind of holes. The bullets are
if you go to the Spanish Parliament these days, you can still see the holes in the roof.
Right. And they actually held everyone in there for almost a day. And there was this very famous broadcast from King Juan Carlos coming on TV to say, actually, don't do this.
Yeah. Juan Carlos came out and essentially argued to put an end to this, and because he's the chief of he has command of the armed forces. Mm-hmm. What's the term for that?
The commander-in-chief.
The commander-in-chief, exactly. Yeah. Chief of command, I was saying. No. And so he essentially came out, did this broadcast, and the whole thing kind of died down. But for a moment, it did look as if Spanish democracy was on the verge of falling and collapsing just a few years after it had been developed. To me, there's a beautiful moment in that very sad episode, which is when Fraga, the leader of the Popular Party, went all across the chamber to sit down with Carrillo, the leader of the Communist Party. I just brought up his accusations about genocide against Juan. You brought up how he also, Fraga, has been accused of being a Franco minister, and that would, in principle, discard him to be a reformist. To me, the fact that Fraga went across the room and just sat down next to the most vulnerable leftist in the chamber shows that the spirit of everyone in that chamber was to bring these guys out. Okay? There was no hesitation within that chamber. There was no political party there willing to profit from any sort of disruption. They all stuck together through this. The prime minister was basically taken away at the point of gun at some point. But the deputies were in tune with society and knew that these were military hardliners, disgruntled military that did not like how the country was going. I have come to realize that Suarez, being effective as he was as the first democratic prime minister, wasn't really effective at all in changing the economy. Mm-hmm. He wasn't liberalizing the economy at any point. Instead, he was just, kneeling down to whatever the unions were asking for, completely dismissing the needs of investors and businesses. Businesses considered lockout during this period, so that's quite strong. And to me, it's now become apparent that a lot of the unrest from these years, it's to be put on the fact that a lot of effort was placed on the transition of the political system, but not a lot of reforms were done in the economic front. Sometimes they talk about how they did the Toledo Pact, for instance, but the Toledo Pact is just an agreement to just more spending and more generous pensions and more subsidies and whatever, right? And it was supposed to bring down inflation, and inflation kept rising, right? So I think that all of that unrest just hit you have the political violence with ETA, the terrorist group, right, which was targeting also military leaders at this time. And they rose up, and just like they rose up, they came down after they realized they did not have support from the king. Now there's been some hesitation about why did the king took a few hours to react and why. I guess there's some internal dynamics there that can be brought to questions. But I think he was navigating complicated waters because it's true, society wasn't on that end. The politicians were not, none of them were happy that was happening, of course. But these guys took control of the parliament. The Congress was kidnapped, right? So I think he did have to probably navigate a lot of private calls that some of them have become apparent and don't have any suspicions on the end of the king. But I do have my hesitations about many other private actions that he's had that to me have been very disappointed to learn from. And by the way, we've learned from these wrongdoings recently because there's been a lot of there's a very secretive treatment of Juan Carlos by the media here. He was always able to, to find a way not to get this stuff leaked out. But then it all leaked out.
Why is that, I think?
It's quite telling, the pictures with the mistresses, for instance, they always came out in foreign magazines.
Right. Yeah.
Not here. I don't know. I think he was such a powerful figure and well-liked figure that you could maybe fear that you would get the backlash, right? You for criticizing him. But no, once the allegations have been made public, his image has crumbled, and that's why he left, and he's in Abu Dhabi. And today people, I guess, look at the political legacy positively, but the man doesn't really get. I mean, he'll go to where he knows. When he comes back to Spain, he goes to those places where he knows he'll be liked. So he attends some events when he knows where he knows he will be applauded and everything. But I don't think he's very popular anymore. His son has to now, eat up the fact that his father damaged the reputation of the House of Bourbon and the monarchy. He's doing everything in his power to behave as a very, subtle man, very much of a reformist king, kind of a boring king if you compare it to Juan Carlos. Sure. Some people complain he's kind of he looks like a well-trained, high-paid bureaucrat or something like this. But he does have a pristine image abroad, and I think he's doing kind of a good job. I'm pro-monarchy. I wasn't when I was younger, but then you realize how much of a mess Spanish politics are, and you realize the mediating role that it has over, which is not, it doesn't fix your problems, but I think it does. I just think, who would the president of our republic be in a country where we don't get along on anything? And I see the numbers and the names that some people on the left and on the right suggest to be a real head of state, not the king, not the monarchy. We should have someone like X. Right. And X is someone that, the other side would never accept and never feel represented. So, I mean, and it's quite cost effective. That is something that is not like very expensive monarchy like the British. But that's a kind of a good point in its core.
Yeah, we're going to discuss the monarchy more in depth in a future episode, because that's also a very animating topic here as well. Okay. So, Diego, we've covered a lot of ground about the transition in Spain. And just to cap it off, there's this one element that I think is the relevant question, which is, how do you measure something being a successful democratic transition? So, we have all of these ideas about the institutions, we have the elections, we have all these things. And this is why I think I don't fall into the camp of the regime of 78 critique, where it's just these powerful elites recycled from Franco continuing. It wasn't a real rupture, because I guess implicitly to me it seems quite obvious that there is a clear transition. It's not continuity. All the institutions have really been transformed into a new version of themselves, and also many more new institutions also. But what is your kind of mental model for thinking about, this really was successful?
Well, at the end of the day, I think we shouldn't overcomplicate things. At the end of the day, Spain had gone through a traumatic 1920s, which just became extremely more traumatic in the 1930s with a republic that collapsed, a civil war, and then a very lengthy dictatorship. And to think that in just a few years, the same society that had even killed each other 2 generations ago, and that had been living passively under a dictatorship and had not really been able to mount up any bottom-up alternative to it. I think it was essentially given a choice, and people chose to stick to the center. That's why in all these elections, the most popular vote was that of the moderate reformist Franco minister. Well, not minister, he had been the head of the public broadcaster, but he was the one appointed by the king to lead the... And I think it kind of reflects that people wanted change, but just moderately, right? And change, but safely. And change, but without any revolutionary or any violence or any radicalism. And there is a painting celebrating the transition in the Spanish Congress, and it's called El Abrazo, the hug. And I think that's what Spaniards did at this point. Should you always look forward? No, I don't think it's always necessary to look forward. Sometimes you need backwards to understand where you come from. And I think it's all right for younger generations to do that. And I think you should then get stuck in looking back. I think many of the mistakes or the shortcomings of our fathers and grandfathers should be looked at with a lot more compassion and with a lot more comprehension of what the situation in society was like. It's always going to be more popular to say, well, they just hit a switch and went from the Franco regime to the Franco-led democracy, or the other way around. Well, we just gave out everything, like we had power to develop something good, and we just created this constitution that gives a lot of power to separatists and a lot of power to... But I don't think it's that. I think that it's in our hands to change whatever we don't like of Spanish democracy right now. But Spaniards are very hard on themselves sometimes. Like our democracy is more or less accepted as one of the top-ranking democracies of the last few years. And if we care about it, then we should be concerned with what this government is doing to it, with a lot of political appointments to our constitutional court, which is equivalent to the U.S. Supreme Court, and a lot of other elements that are extremely painful for democracy and that are undermining the rule of law today, right? So I think that we have kind of been stuck in that game of looking too much backwards. I agree with a lot of the criticism that we've discussed today, and with a lot of it, I can see its point, even though I may not fully embrace it. But I think when conversations are had about the past, we need to also see what the conditions and what the situations were at the time. We cannot fall into the nirvana fallacy of thinking that, well, the opposite of what we had would look like nirvana, so then I'll, of course, choose nirvana. Well, the nirvana wasn't going to be a choice when you had a military leader on top of your country from 1939 to 1975 following a civil war, and a country in which civil society was probably too passive to take up the role and create something significant. It was a democratic transition. It succeeded. It had shortcomings. And when we look back into it, we should understand them and correct them now. And by the way, not let those in power now erode some good elements that we have, which are a lot of them. And that's happening right now in Spain. We'll talk about it some other day. Yeah, we will get to that element of the conversation also on a future episode. But for the next episode, we're going to do something a bit more contemporary. We're going to discuss the politics and worldview of Javier Milei in Argentina. Looking forward to that. And there's a lot to talk about. He's had an amazing first year, but of course, it's such a transformational period right now for Argentina, and we are close to the Milei government in the different liberal organizations of which I'm a part of, and you're involved with some of them here in Spain, and it'll be interesting to talk about how he's been managing this first year in power and what's to come. Okay, great. Thank you, Diego. Until next time. This was the Capitalismo Podcast.